So the wise men, the Magi, are led by a vision. They see a star, literally a vision, and they follow its light from their eastern lands into Israel to the stable in Bethlehem, where overwhelmed with joy, they pay homage to Jesus. For Matthew, this moment clearly fulfills the vision in Isaiah 60, which is not included in our readings today for some reason, of this future time when Gentile nations will come streaming toward the light of Israel to worship her God. Matthew even goes so far as to echo Isaiah, who mentions gifts of gold and frankincense. So the Magi are Gentiles, outsiders, whose purpose in the story is to fulfill an ancient prophecy. Fine, but here's where I think things get really interesting. Because before the Magi exit stage left forever, they make a very important choice. Instead of reporting Jesus' whereabouts back to the secretly murderous King Herod, as requested, they go home by another road. Now let's pause on that decision for a minute. Something important happens here. Something about the Magi's vision changes. At first, they're simply seeking to find and meet this new foreign king. But now they decide to protect him. The Magi do not simply encounter the story of Jesus, they become part of it. They shift from observers to actors. They encounter God in the form of this vulnerable child, and they are moved to make a stand for his life, even at risk to their own. It seems to me that this story has something to tell us about our role as Christians in the world. It teaches us that our faith is not passive and safe, but active and risky. It reminds us that we are like the Magi, called to be not observers, but actors in the story that God has handed us. It sends us in mission to cultivate and protect life in the places where life is most vulnerable. And our job is to figure out how to do that, not just once, but again and again. How do we take up God's story? How do we become responsible for the vulnerable life of Jesus in the world? This account of the Magi reminds me of a true story told by the writer Atul Gawande about a young doctor named Bill Thomas. At 31, just a few years out of med school, Thomas took a position as the medical director of an 80-bed nursing facility in upstate New York. Now, this nursing home actually had an excellent reputation for the quality of care that it delivered to its residents. But to Thomas, it was like the shadow of the valley of death. People sat around in the gray halls, or gazed stupidly at the TV, or lay in bed all day moaning. They were beset by what he calls the three plagues of nursing home existence: boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. So Thomas took up responsibility for these vulnerable lives. He hatched a plan to bring life back into the building by filling it with pets and plants and children. He had no research to back up this crazy idea, just a hunch, just a star he was following to see where it might take him. Somehow he managed to sweet-talk state legislators into waiving the usual health codes, and soon his facility had acquired an on-site childcare and after-school program for the staff's kids, a flower garden, a vegetable garden, plants in every room, 2 dogs, 4 cats, a warren of rabbits, a coop of chickens, and 100, count them, 100 parakeets. For a while, it was total chaos. Dogs pooped on the floor, and nurses refused to clean it because it wasn't in their job description. The parakeets arrived before the cages and had to be held in the beauty salon, where staff later captured and caged them one by one in a cloud of feathers. No one knew what they were doing, but the change forced everyone, including the residents, to pitch in. The facility blossomed with birdsong and the shouts of children and the bright, waxy green of spider plants and peace lilies. The place started to feel less like an institution and more like a home. Maybe most important, the cared for became caretakers, joining nurses in daily rounds to water and feed. Gowand writes, "The effect on residents soon became impossible to ignore. The residents began to wake up and come to life. People who we had believed weren't able to speak started speaking," Thomas said. People who had been completely withdrawn and non-ambulatory started coming to the nurses' station and saying, "I'll take the dog for a walk." All the parakeets were adopted and named by the residents. The lights turned back on in people's eyes. Like the Magi, Thomas was seized with a God-given vision. And like the Magi's vision, that vision involved taking up responsibility for helpless lives. It involved taking a risk. It involved shifting from observer to actor. And in making this stand for the lives of his elderly charges, Thomas in turn passed on that vision, that responsibility, and the sense of purpose that came with it to them. They too found new life in having to care for souls even more powerless than their own. Maybe that's why God comes into the world as a baby, a poor, illegitimate, hunted baby at that. Because God knows that we begin to come alive spiritually when we begin to care for another. And what better way to teach that than to be the other that needs our care? Well, they pass from our story as abruptly as they come into it, those Magi. They return to their own countries, and we never hear from them again. But I can't help imagining that having had their own hearts melted by their encounter with Jesus, having decided to protect him, they have gained new life as well. I see them noticing things that they hadn't noticed before. The savage way an owner kicks his servant by the city gate. The lonely face of the man reduced to begging since he lost his land to debt. The desperation of the widow in the marketplace who buys damaged fruit half price. I see them seeking ways to bring the light of dignity and self-sufficiency back into the eyes of others. A light not unlike the light that led them to the new Prince of Peace, a light that has beckoned all of Jesus's followers down through the generations, right down to ourselves, inviting us not simply to witness the story of God's fragile love in the world, but to join it. Amen.
Amen.